Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this March 2nd, 2020 meeting of Troy City Council. My name is William Lutz. I am Council President. I want to give a warm welcome to all of the Miami East students in attendance tonight. You have probably come to one of the more exciting City Council meetings we've had in a long time. We have a lot of items on the agenda, including two public hearings. This time we will begin with our invocation given by Mr. Schweizer, and we will go directly into the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we assemble here tonight by your grace and under the flag of freedom. Give us the wisdom to realize the gifts you have given us and the strengths needed to protect them. Bless those who serve overseas, who are away from their loved ones, keeping the flame of freedom lit for all of us. We also ask that you protect those that make our streets safe and who respond when needed. To all this we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schweizer. I would also like to remind our audience to please turn off or silence your cell phones for our meeting tonight. This time we'll ask Mrs. Knight to please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert.
Present.
Mr. Terwilliger. Mr. Schweizer.
Here.
Mrs. Snee. Here. Mr. Rozelle.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Here.
Mr. Allen.
Present.
Mr. Twist.
Move to excuse Mr. Twist.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Sievert and seconded by Mr. Phillips to excuse Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Rozelle.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee. Yes. Mr. Schweizer.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr.
Motion.
Twist is excused.
Motion to excuse Mr. Terwilliger.
Second. 8 million
Mr. Phillips has moved to excuse Mr. Terwilliger, and Mr. Allen seconded the motion, I believe. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schweizer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozelle.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger is excused.
Wonderful. This time we will begin with our public hearings. Our first public hearing is on Resolution R16-2020, Agricultural District Application for 25.15 acres on Lytle Road. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the resolution?
Resolution number R16-2020, resolution approving application of Sherry H. Mumpower to place land in agricultural district.
If anyone wishes to speak on this resolution, now would be a perfect time to do that. Please come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume. Seeing none, we declare the public hearing for this resolution closed. We'll move on to our second public hearing, which is Ordinance 08-2020, which is to amend the general plan of Halifax Villas Plan Development. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 08-2020, ordinance amending the general plan of the Halifax Villas Plan Development, PDR, in the city of Troy, Ohio, and rezoning an 8.015 acre parcel added to the Halifax Villas Plan Development as a part of the amended general plan from AR, Agricultural Residential Zoning District, to a residential plan development, PDR.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Again, this public hearing is open to anyone. If you wish to speak on the ordinance, now is a good time to do that. Please come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume. Please come forward.
My name's Cheryl Cosner, and I live at 171 Finsbury Lane. And I will be at the very opening of the street where it goes back to this building. So my main concern is that the street itself be completed with curbs, and that the look in front of my house, since I face that street, although I'm a Finsbury person, is going to be affected by the total deal that they do as they come into that area from my street, which is a dead-end street right now with a barrier. And my second concern is that I'm seeing from what my friend across the street brought to me from a meeting that was held by the fellow who's doing this. It's showing this party house. It looks to me like it's going to be raised up and elevated, and he's going to be doing gardening around it. But when you raise anything up in that area over there, there's runoff, and it's going to be coming toward our backyard. And I'm kind of concerned that this meeting was held. I didn't know anything about it. I got your letter because I'm within 250 feet of what they're doing. But I don't feel like I had very much notice that they were going to be building this building back there. A pickleball court and a swimming pool and a party house is a lot of noise. So my main concerns are that the entrance into that area is clean and kept well, and not what I have right now with the farm field backing up and weeds growing across the back of our property where they put in that new water piping that they put in there some time ago. So those are my concerns.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to speak. My name's Steve Cosner. That's my better half. We're concerned that Nottingham was, however short it was when it was a dedicated street, had full curbs, gutters. I don't believe there was any sanitary sewer or storm sewer associated with that approximately 75, 100 feet of Nottingham that's been there for, well, way since our residing in that house. We go back to 1996. We're not sure about what infrastructure is going to be put between Finsbury and the party house. And in as much as we would prefer full pavement, gutters, sanitary sewer, and as much as would be possible, storm sewers. One of our concerns is that area, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is floodplain. And the Kidder Ditch, which is not too far from the party house, and it's actually between the party house and the development that's going up right now, has had some plans by the Troy Department of Engineering that have been unfunded for quite some time, and keeps getting put back. I'm concerned that the road leading up to the party house have storm drains to take off any flow, because over the 24 years that we've been in that house, that field has flooded 3 or 4 times to a depth of 3 or 4 feet, over which the road from what is now Nottingham to the party house is planned. So my point is, I would like the road extending Nottingham to be a fully dedicated and fully constructed dedicated extension of Nottingham, including curbs, gutters, sanitary sewer, and storm sewer as might be required, rather than what we see over on the development over off of Troy Pittsburgh Road. What we see is just asphalt paved, what might be described as a driveway. So that's all I had to say on the matter.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cosman. Any other residents wish to speak tonight? Please come forward, give your name and address.
Hi, my name is Diane Fisher, and I live at 153, Finsbury. I guess it's been a couple years since the last time I spoke, so I do appreciate Frank changing from initially it was 12 homes to revamping it and restructuring that. So I'm more in agreement with that than before. I did call FEMA in November of last year, and I was transferred on to speak to Ohio Department of Natural Resource, and they did explain to me that the floodplain can be built up according to regulation to elevate the soil or fill or whatever, things like that. But they said the last time, because I asked when was the last time that area had been mapped with FEMA, and she stated that it was 1981, and FEMA wants to update it, but because of money have been unable to update that area over there. So it's my understanding that Frank is working with Choice One to have that evaluated, and they're going to work with FEMA and give them their evaluation of that. But my question is, and I don't know really how to word this, you might know a little bit more what I'm trying to say, will that pass FEMA's regulation to be out of the floodplain? I did send Frank two or three pictures a couple weeks ago to show him a year or two ago when we had a lot of rain, how the water breached over. I live at 153, and I live more in the teardrop, I guess you want to say, of the 8 acres. It's closer to Staunton Grange and the fire department. So the water breached over from the property where he's building now and just started flooding the back area where I live and was pushing on up toward the larger part of where he's going to do the build it right there. And so I just want to make sure that, and Frank assured me in the text that he feels like what he's going to do will help, and it certainly wouldn't get any worse. So I guess my concern is just, I'm just a few feet, I'm not kidding you guys, I'm just a few feet from having to pay flood insurance. And so I just would feel so comfortable in just knowing that everything passes FEMA's regulation and guidelines. And I'm sure if it was any one of you with your property, you'd feel the same way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Anyone else wish to speak this evening?
Good evening. I'm Jennifer Jimenez at 166 Finsbury, and it does feel like we were just here doing this, even though it's been almost 2 years. And as most of you know, the 8 acres in question was subject to a referendum in April 2018. There was a committee and a large group of residents who have met with Mr. Harlow recently and reviewed his proposed plans to relocate the clubhouse into the 8-acre floodplain. One major concern that some of the residents voiced, in addition to the flooding and the development of the 8-acre floodplain, which does lie in the high-risk AE zone, is that there will only be one point of access for vehicles off of Nottingham Road. there will be a golf cart path from the retirement community, but only one road for vehicles. This will have a direct impact to an existing residential neighborhood that the clubhouse is not intended to serve. Residents of Finsbury, Tamworth, Shaftesbury, and the various other streets will not have access, yet we are the ones that will feel the full impact of increased traffic due to there being only one inlet for vehicular traffic for both delivery trucks as well as patrons of the clubhouse, who will all be residents of the retirement community. We have been told there will be 280 addresses in the retirement community, so the traffic flow could be substantial, although unknown at this point. Additionally, it is our understanding that Choice One Engineering will be doing a hydraulic study, which is supposed to be submitted to the city for approval and then to FEMA for a revision to be made to the flood maps. We have heard that there should be a net neutral effect on the floodplain, but we wanted to know if someone could confirm if this is the case, and if so, when should we expect the results of the study to be available, and will the city then be reviewing the results of that study prior to taking a vote on the ordinance? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other residents wish to speak on this ordinance? Okay. Tonight was the public hearing, and tonight we will hold the second hearing, or the second reading of this ordinance. This item will be assigned to the Community and Economic Development, and they will most likely have a meeting next Monday at 6 o'clock. This item will then come back again in front of City Council for its third reading, in which it is possible that the item could be voted on within 2 weeks. So that's where the process stands now. If there's no one else that wishes to speak, we'll close the public hearing at this time. At this time, we will review the minutes of the last meeting. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the February 18th, 2020 minutes of City Council?
Minutes of Council, February 18, 2020. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee reported recommending legislation be prepared to accept easements associated with 3 completed roadway projects. Committee also recommended legislation be prepared to authorize the release of mortgages and assignment assumptions and leases related to the Sherwood Shopping Center. Law and Ordinance Committee reported regarding a notice of 2 liquor permits. Ordinance number 06-2020, accepting easements for street projects, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 07-2020, release of mortgage liens related to Sherwood of Troy, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 08-2020, amend general plan of Halifax Villas Plan Development, first reading. A presentation was made by Tree Care Company announcing a grant to match that of the Robinson grant. There was also a presentation regarding Clubhouse Dream Builders. Following that, there being no other business, council adjourned at 7:37.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll make that motion as presented.
It has been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to approve the minutes of the last meeting. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Sneed.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Wonderful. Moving into committee reports tonight, and we have quite a few. We will begin with the Building and Utilities Committee, chaired by Mr. Allen.
Thank you. This committee met on February 28th regarding accepting 10 feet of additional utility easements along some roadway areas in the Villas of Halifax Patio Home Subdivision. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to accept the additional utility easements associated with the Villas of Halifax Patio Home Subdivision. As this development is currently under construction, committee supports emergency legislation so that building within the subdivision is not delayed. Respectfully submitted, William Twist, John Twilliger, and Zachary Allen, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Do council members have any comments or questions on this report? Moving on to the Community and Economic Development Report, we have one report tonight from Mrs. Sneed.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met on February 24th to consider recommending that a city-owned 2.446-acre parcel located off Rutherford Drive be annexed. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to commence the process to file petitions with the Board of Commissioners of Miami County, Ohio, for the annexation of the 2.446-acre parcel of city-owned property, which will commence the annexation process. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this committee report? Seeing none, we will move on to the Personnel Committee. And standing in for Mr. Twist will be Mr. Sievert tonight to give one report and also a motion for a board appointment.
I don't have a board appointment.
Oh.
Perhaps this is it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Concerning the Personnel Committee, this committee met on February 24th to consider amendments to the salary ordinance to establish the position of Management Analysis 1 in the Development Office and to establish a lead operator position in the Street Department. It is recommended that it is a recommendation of this committee the legislation be prepared as follows. 1, amend salary ordinance number 052-2018 to establish the position of Management Analysis 1 at the Management 1 pay range in the Development Office. 2, amend salary ordinance number 0-63-2018 to establish a lead operator position at the rate of $32.65 per hour. Respectfully submitted, Zachary Allen, myself, and William Twist as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Are there any comments or questions on that report? Mr. Sievert, you can move on.
Regarding the personnel matter with the appointment, the mayor has requested council to approve the appointment of Matthew Post to the Enterprise Zone Tax Incentive Review Council to fill the unexpired term of William Rozell. I move that council approve the appointment of Matthew Post to the Enterprise Zone Tax Incentive Review Council for a term commencing immediately and continuing through October 19, 2020.
I'll second that.
It has been moved by Mr. Sievert and seconded by Mr. Phillips to appoint Mr. Post to the committee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Appointment is approved.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Sievert. Moving on to the Recreations and Parks Committee, Mr. Schilling has 3 reports this evening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. The first report, this committee met on February 24th to consider a use agreement for the August 1st concert at Treasure Island Park that will include the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages. Events that include the sale and consumption of alcohol at this venue require specific council action. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute the Treasure Island non-ticketed use agreement for the August 1st, 2020 concert at Treasure Island Park. This is being respectively submitted by Mr. Bobby Phillips, Mr. John Twilliger, and myself. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Are there any comments or questions from council members on this item? Mr. Schilling, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The second item that we're going to be discussing, we met on February 24th to review the Memorandum of Understanding between the city and the schools detailing whereby the city will convey parkland at Hook School and Cookson School. The schools will establish ball fields to be scheduled and used by the city, and a possible transfer of surplus school playground equipment to the city. As a part of the committee's review, 2 amendments to the Memorandum of Understanding draft were incorporated. With the proposed 2 changes to the Memorandum of Understanding, it is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the conveyance of the approximate .05 acres at Cookson School, also known as Campbell Park, and the approximate 3.2 acres at Hook School, also known as Hook Park, to the Troy City School Board of Education and authorizing the execution of the Memorandum of Understanding. This is being respectively submitted by Mr. Bobby Phillips, Mr. John Twilliger, and myself.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Do council members have any comments or questions on this item? Mr. Schilling, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The third item that we had discussed, again, we met on February 24th to consider a recommendation from the Board of Park Commissioners that an approximate 1/10 acre of Archer Park be declared as surplus and offered for sale, as the small area is not needed for park purposes. This small parcel is to the rear of 636 Shaftesbury Road, where the property owner placed structures beyond the property line. The committee members concur that property owners should use due diligence and confirm that they are not encroaching onto public property or right-of-way prior to any construction occurring. We do note that a recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners following the board inspecting the property and determining that the approximate 1/10 of an acre is not needed for public purpose. While the undersigned committee members agree that selling the parcel, this is the majority recommendation. While the undersigned committee members agree that selling the parcel is rewarding inappropriate behavior of encroaching on the public park land, we support selling the parcel as the best method of resolving this situation. The undersigned committee members recommend that legislation be prepared in support of the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners, and that legislation be prepared declaring as surplus approximately 1/10 of an acre to the rear of 636 Shaftesbury Road, and that said area then to be offered for sale. And that is respectfully submitted by Mr. Bobby Phillips and Mr. John Twilliger. We also came up with a minority recommendation, and the undersigned committee member does not believe that the encroachment onto this piece of city property should be handled by selling a piece of property, and therefore does not support the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners, and recommends that the council does not sell the reference portion of Archer Park, and as respectively submitted by myself.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. I am under the understanding with this particular report that you are requesting that this go to a second reading and a further discussion with the Parks and Recreation Committee.
That is correct.
Excellent. We will schedule that meeting, and tonight we will just dispense with the first reading of this legislation. We'll have a second reading at our next meeting. Do council members have any comments or questions on this item?
I do have a comment, sir.
Please.
Mr. Kerber, I would appreciate if you could make that Park Rec Committee meeting whenever it is announced, if possible.
Is that one tomorrow? Is that one tomorrow?
No.
No, that's our meeting, the committee
It'll be
meeting.
a Parks and Recreation Committee meeting.
Has the property owner been notified of this? Oh, okay.
Well, I haven't, but this was the first time that I've obviously hearing this, so. If you want me to.
Not right now.
Okay,
You'll have your opportunity.
all right, thank you.
At this time, I'm going to ask Mr. Rozelle if he would kindly give the safety and health report for Mr. Terwilliger, who is absent this evening.
Certainly, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. This committee met on February 24th to provide a memorandum recommendation for the city to support the Ohio Memorandum of Understanding, which would permit collaboration between the state and local governments related to current opioid litigation. Success could result in Troy accessing funds from the prospective settlement for the purpose of covering expenses incurred by opioid abatement efforts. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to support the Ohio Memorandum of Understanding and to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute any related documents due to the March 6th deadline for participation. This committee supports emergency legislation. It's respectfully submitted by myself, Jeffrey Schilling, and John Twilliger, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell. Do council members have any comments or questions on this item? Moving on to our final report of the evening, Mr. Phillips with the Streets and Sidewalks Committee.
Well, it'll be the final committee, but there are several reports.
There are several reports.
Thank you, Mr. Lutz. On February 24th, this committee met to review the proposed 2020 paving program. The program includes sections of 21 streets, and there is a minor typo in that first paragraph. It indicates 1,436 lane miles, but it's actually 14.36 lane miles on that report. As well as the repaving of the final section of the recreation trail along the Miami Shores Golf Course. The detailed report includes the funding for elements of the paving program and the list of street areas included in this program. And it is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the 2020 paving program at a cost not to exceed $1,025,000. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Do any council members have any comments or questions? Mr. Phillips, you can continue.
Thank you, sir. Again, on February 24th, the committee met to consider recommending the council accept easements associated with the State Route 41 Interconnect project, which is scheduled for construction in 2021. It is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared accepting easements related to the State Route 41 Interconnect project Phase 2, and to further authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to execute any related documents. This is also respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Do any council members have any comments or questions on this item? Mr. Phillips, you can continue.
Thank you. The committee met also on February 24 to consider two separate easement actions. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to, number one, accept a utility easement at 1262 Peters Road. Number two, vacate utility easements on two lots on Creekwood Drive along the east property line of IL 10911 and along the west property line of IL, which is in lot 10912. And number three, authorize the execution or filing of any associated documents by the Director of Public Service and Safety. As both relate to completed projects, committee does support emergency legislation on this item. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Do council members have any comments or questions on this item? Mr. Phillips, you can continue.
I think our last item with the committee meeting on February 24 to consider consenting to ODOT resurfacing the existing ramp from State Route 41 to southbound I-75 at no cost to the city. It is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared to consenting to an ODOT project that will include resurfacing the existing ramp from State Route 41 to southbound I-75. And based on the format provided by ODOT, this would also be emergency legislation, and we do support that. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Are there any comments or questions from council members? We have concluded a lot of committee reports, and we have a full agenda. Now is the time for citizens' comments for any item that's on the agenda. If you wish to speak, please come to the podium, give your name and address, and you have 2 minutes to say whatever you wish on the items on the agenda. Mr. Kerber will be our timekeeper. If anybody wishes to speak on any item, please come forward.
Hi, I'm Christina Schaefer, and I am speaking on the surplus sale of the acreage behind my house, which is at 636 Shaftesbury. I will say that I was given permission by the park superintendent to do that when I did it. I have lived at the house for 15 years and maintained that property the entire time I've been there. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble. I know that we did a surplus just down the street a couple months ago to Chuck Carnum's house also, where he too was maintaining land prior to his property line. So all I'm asking is for you guys to consider to let me go ahead and purchase the land that was already there and that I had been using for the last couple years. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Schaefer. Do any other residents or those in attendance have anything that they'd like to say on any item on the agenda tonight? Seeing none, we will move into the business portion of tonight's meeting. We'll begin with resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R13, 2020?
Resolution number R13, 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the 2020 paving program, cost not to exceed $1,025,000. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to move at this time?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Phillips, and it has been seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved by Mr. Schweizer. It has been seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R14, 2020?
Resolution number R14, 2020. Resolution to accept the One Ohio Memorandum of Understanding and declaring an emergency. This was reported on this evening, first reading.
How does council wish to move on this item?
Suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Rozell and seconded by Mrs. Snee to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt. Mr. Schilling has seconded the motion. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R15, 2020?
Resolution number R15, 2020, a resolution authorizing consent and cooperation with the Ohio Department of Transportation for the resurfacing of the ramp from State Route 41 to southbound Interstate 75 within the right-of-way of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This has been requested by ODOT at no cost to the city. This is the first reading, and I will note that the copies in your packet did not have the words "in declaring an emergency" in the title, but that has been added to the original first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to dispose of this item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Schilling and seconded by Mr. Rozell to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
I don't think.
Can I vote?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
I thought I voted twice.
I'm sorry. Okay. My mistake. Mr. Swayzer, you're accounted for.
Thank you.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Maybe.
It's been moved by Mrs. Snee to adopt the resolution, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R16, 2020?
Resolution number R16, 2020. Resolution approving application of Sherry H. Mumpower to place land in agricultural district. This is land on Lytle Road that has been an agricultural district for several years. It must be reapplied for every 5 years. There was a public hearing this evening. This will be on the committee agenda next Monday.
Correct. We will have a committee meeting on this next Monday, so therefore this will stand as the first reading. This will go to a second reading at our next meeting. That concludes the resolutions. We'll move on to ordinances. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Ordinance 08, 2020.
Ordinance number 08-2020, ordinance amending the general plan of the Halifax Villas Plan Development, PDR, in the city of Troy, Ohio, and rezoning an 8.015-acre parcel added to the Halifax Villas Plan Development as a part of the amended general plan from AR, Agricultural Residential Zoning District, to a Residential Plan Development, PDR. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. There was a committee public hearing this evening, and this will be on the committee agenda also for next Monday.
Excellent. Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Again, for those residents that spoke on this item tonight, we will have a committee meeting next Monday at 6 o'clock. The Community and Economic Development Committee will review this item. It will be back on our agenda in 2 weeks. So this stands as the second reading. It will move on to a third reading. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 09-2020?
Ordinance number 09-2020, ordinance amending ordinance number 063-2018, fixing salaries and wages of certain employees of the city of Troy, Ohio. This is adding the position of lead operator as reported on this evening. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to move?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Sievert and seconded by Mr. Schilling to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has adopted to move the ordinance. Mrs. Snee has seconded the motion. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 010-2020?
Ordinance number 010-2020, ordinance amending ordinance number 052-2018 as amended by ordinance number 019-2019 and 039-2019, fixing salaries and wages of certain employees of the city of Troy, Ohio. This will add the position of management analyst into the development office. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to move on the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Snee and seconded by Mr. Schilling to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt the ordinance, and Mrs. Snee has seconded that motion. Are there any final comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, thank you. Will you please read ordinance 011-2020?
Ordinance number 011-2020. Ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to petition the Board of Commissioners of Miami County, Ohio, for the annexation of real property to the City of Troy. This would annex 2.446 acres in Staunton Township to the city. The first step of the process is authorizing the petition to the county. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to move on this item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Rozell to suspend the three reading rule, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt the ordinance. It has been seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any further comments or questions from council members on this item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 012, 2020?
Ordinance number 012, 2020, ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to execute a Treasure Island non-ticketed use agreement for a 2020 event at Treasure Island Park. This would be for the concert on August 1, 2020. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Snee to suspend the three reading rule and seconded by Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It has been moved for adoption by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any further comments or questions on this item? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, I will ask you to read ordinance 013, 2020.
Ordinance number 013, 2020.
Oh, that's right. Okay, that's right.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Ordinance declaring municipally owned real property as no longer needed for municipal purposes and authorizing the sale of such excess property. This has to do with the sale of 0.1221 acres, a part of Archer Park, was reported on this evening. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This will stand as the first reading. This will be reassigned to the Parks and Recreation Committee, and the second reading will be held in 2 weeks. Mrs. Knight, I will ask you to please read ordinance 014, 2020.
Ordinance number 014, 2020. Ordinance declaring municipally owned real property as surplus and no longer needed for municipal purposes, conveying said surplus property to the Troy City Schools Board of Education, and authorizing the Board of Park Commissioners and the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the Troy City Schools Board of Education related to the conveyance of said property and reflecting future education and recreational opportunities. There was a committee report on this evening. This is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How does council wish to move on this item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mrs. Snee and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt the ordinance. It has been seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions from council members? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, I will please ask you to read ordinance 015, 2020.
Ordinance number 015, 2020, ordinance accepting easements related to the State Route 41, West Main Street, Traffic Signal Interconnect Project, Phase 2, in the city of Troy, Ohio. This was also a committee report this evening. This is the first reading.
How does council wish to dispose of the item?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schilling to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any final comments or questions from council members? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 016-2020?
Ordinance number 016-2020, ordinance accepting utility easement in the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is associated with the development at 1262 Peters Road. First reading.
How do council members wish to move on this item?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schilling to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It has been moved by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Are there any final comments or questions from council members? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee? Mrs.
Yes.
Snee? Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 017-2020?
Ordinance number 017-2020. Ordinance approving the vacation of utility easements and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
How does council wish to move on the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Schilling to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt the ordinance. It has been seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions on the item? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, I will ask you to read the final ordinance of the evening, ordinance 018-2020.
Ordinance number 018-2020, ordinance accepting the dedication of additional utility easements for the Villas of Halifax Patio Home Subdivision, part of the Halifax Villas Plan Development within the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Does council wish to act on this item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Siebert and seconded by Mr. Phillips to suspend the three reading rule. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Mr. Schweizer has moved to adopt the ordinance. Mrs. Snee has seconded that motion. Are there any final comments or questions from council members this evening? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Allen?
Yes.
Mr. Siebert?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
We have come to the end of our business portion of tonight's agenda. At this time, we want to welcome forward our nonprofit presentation for the evening, Mrs. Shelley Calvert with We Love Birthday Parties.
Hi, everyone. I see a lot of my friends up here. Thank you so much for having me, being interested in what we do. My name is Shelley Calvert. I'm Executive Director of We Love Birthday Parties. Those of you that know me know that my passion is helping kids in need in our community. I've been involved in several organizations, including Reading for Change, where I'm consulting, and been involved in the foster care industry. But 5 years ago, I started a nonprofit called We Love Birthday Parties, and it began out of a youth group at our church who had an idea to help kids in our community who might not be celebrated. So our mission is to spread love through the simple joy of birthday parties for kids in our community who may not otherwise be celebrated. You would be surprised how many kids in our very own community have their birthdays come and go without acknowledgement from their parents or just anyone. And I know this firsthand from having the birthday parties and hearing the kids' comments, some of which I can't repeat because their parents are involved in this opioid situation, or their parents are just otherwise engaged in neglectful activities, alcohol, kinds of things like that. So these are the kids that we're serving with this. So what we do at We Love Birthday Parties is we pack up our parties in tubs, everything we need for a party, and we take them to community centers. We're serving Piqua down to South Dayton. And I know you heard from Clubhouse last time. So we serve Clubhouse, all the Clubhouse locations. We serve Lincoln Center, and we also serve Reading for Change with our birthday parties. So once a month, we go with all of our stuff to these community centers, and we celebrate the kids whose birthdays are that month. It is their absolute favorite day of the month at their program. The thing that makes it so successful and so special for these kids is that they have friends whom they have come to know through these community centers. And so when we have our party, it is including all of the kids. So the kids that we're celebrating that month, so, March birthdays are coming up, they know that it's going to be their special time. And what we do is tell them their job is to feel special. Everyone else's job is to make them feel special. The decor, the cupcakes, the games we play with them, the presents the kids get, it's all amazing. They love it. But the thing they love the most is that they were remembered, that they were acknowledged, that they matter, and that they were cared about. And I had one little boy, we pray with them if we're allowed, and as I was praying over this one little boy, saying, you were born for a reason, you matter, you're loved, and your day that you were born and the month that you were born, that's no accident. That's your day. And this little boy, as I was saying that to him, just kind of melted into me. And that's what it means to these kids. So we go and we do 7 parties a month. We're serving about 220 kids per month with these birthday parties. And then we're also doing something else that's called birthday boxes. And the birthday boxes, I brought an example. In a canvas tote, we have everything it takes for a birthday party celebration at an in-home party. These are given, well, they're requested and given to our casas, so the kids that are in our court system, who these casas know are currently, their birthday's coming up, but there's just nobody there, they'll request one of these and take these themselves to the kids. And it's got just all the decor, it's got a cake mix, it's got a cake pan, so if there's somebody who could bake with this child, they have everything they need in here. Lots of decorations. These things are donated to us. We also give these to Seeds of Hope, which I don't know if you've heard from them yet, but they serve foster kids in our area. So foster families and kids in the court system get a birthday box. We are funded through private donors and grants, and we also receive donations of toys and the things that we need to party. So we're constantly asking for support, and people can help us by monthly donations. Each birthday party that we do at the community centers runs between $150 and $200, and each birthday box runs around $60. So we're asking for support for that. Also volunteers. are needed to do the birthday parties, put the birthday boxes together. We only have a warehouse location because we take our parties out, and we're located right across the street with Reading for Change. In the very, very back, there's a space there that has been leased to us, and there's an elevator. So we have just a warehouse full of things that we need. We're hoping to expand into celebrating teen kids. I've talked to Kelly at the RAC, and we're hoping to do that. Let's see. Oh, one of the other ways that we raise money, we just started doing this. It's the flyer that I sent around. We were gifted beautiful costumes for princesses, all the Disney princesses, by some of the people who help make costumes for the Schuster Center. They're gorgeous. And we rent out or offer out for donation our Princess Pirates and Superheroes to people who can afford birthday parties. And that donation goes to fund kids who do not have birthday parties. So it's another way that we're funded. Thank you for this opportunity to share what we do and how much it means to the kids in our community.
Thank you, Shelley.
You're welcome.
Do council members have any comments or questions for Shelley?
I do.
Go ahead.
What age groups, bottom to top, do you service?
Yeah, good question. The birthday boxes are 1 to 18. The birthday parties, again, we have to reach them through community centers, so they're school-age kids, usually kindergarten to 4th grade. We are working to do teen parties because inviting them into the other parties is distracting to the younger kids, but yet we found preteen and teen kids, junior high, high school kids, they need that validation just as much as anyone else. So, like I said, our goal in 2020 is to work on those teen parties. But, yeah.
Any other comments or questions from council members? Shelley, thank you so much for coming out this evening.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Communications and announcements. Mrs. Knight, are there any?
There are none.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mayor Oda, any comments or questions this evening that you'd like to present?
Just a comment that I was at Riverside today for their Disability Awareness Month. The beginning marches of Awareness Month, and if you've not been out to Riverside, it's a fantastic facility serving clients and their families, and just a really, really great opportunity out there.
Thank you, Mayor. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titrington, do you have anything this evening?
Just one, thank you, Mr. Chair. The dye mill facility, the recycling facility, has opened for the season, believe it or not. It is open Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday from 11 to 7, and Saturday from 8 to 3 o'clock through November, I believe.
A sure sign of spring.
Knock on wood.
Director of Law, Mr. Kerber, do you have anything this evening?
I do not, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. City Auditor, Mr. Frigge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Frigge. I don't have anything other than this week. This weekend, I do believe, is daylight savings time, so please make sure you spring your clocks forward and change the batteries in your smoke detectors. Do council members have any comments tonight they'd like to make?
I do.
Mr. Phillips, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Two things. Number one, related to nonprofits. If anybody listens to the radio, Mendelssohn's or news things, Mendelssohn's business in Dayton is closing, and they have that is the place to go, the first place to go for every last thing, I think is their tagline. I did happen to talk to Mr. Mendelssohn last week and about what are they going to do with some of the stuff that they've got in there, because they have a boatload of stuff. Anyway, there are suitcases, there are toys, there is paper products, office products, envelopes and other related things, and a myriad of other items there. And he indicated to me that if a nonprofit or organization had any use for any of the items that they have in there, that they would entertain donating that to the nonprofit. So if you have any legitimate purpose, and he stressed that legitimate purpose, to use the items and not resell them or other things like that, to write him, and they would be more than willing to open that up to any nonprofit that of the stuff that they have. And I do have his information at home if anybody would like to get a hold of me. So there's that. Number two, a question for our police department. I don't know whether Captain Kunkelman will be able to answer this or whether Mr. Titterington will answer this. As to your crashes in the report, I did note that there were 18 mature-related accidents, and I was just asking what the mature-related indicates. Is that an age consideration or it was an odd thing to me, and then I wanted to note that the youths beat the old guys by 1 on the accident, so they were the highest rated, so I thought that was interesting.
We will get you an answer.
I'm sorry?
We will get you an answer.
I appreciate that, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any other council members have any comments or questions this evening? Do any of our city staff members have any comments or questions this evening that are strewn about the audience today? Seeing none, this is the audience participation portion of the program. If you would like to speak on any topic you so wish to speak on, please come forward to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Mr. Connor, 1210 South Clay Street, Troy, Ohio. Mr. President, I think everybody in this room is aware of the virus. It keeps changing daily. I don't want to be known as Chicken Little, and I'm not trying to be Chicken Little, but I have 3 questions for this council and the mayor and Mr. T. Are you, as a city official or city father, doing anything to prepare for coronavirus? 2, are you going to travel to Japan or Europe or Germany on your trip? And if so, and when you come back, will you be quarantined? And 3, the student exchange, will they continue to exchange students from Japan back and forth with this virus?
Mr. Titterington or Mayor, would either one of you like to address Mr. Connard's questions?
Gee, thank you very much. So what was your first question?
What are the preparations?
Okay. So the Miami County Public Health is our health district of record. They have been preparing. I have a conference call tomorrow with the governor and the state health organization to discuss what the overall state plan is. In terms of travel, we have not canceled any trips at this point. I mean, they're not scheduled, they're not confirmed at all, but if we were to be told by the state or the federal government that travel is not advisable, then we would adjust accordingly. As far as our Japanese student delegation or sister city delegation, they would follow their own protocols in their country, as well as adhere to whatever the United States tells them.
All right, and to carry on just a little bit further with your comments there, when you do find out from the state and from your health district and stuff here, are you going to put that into the paper so that the citizen can see that you're trying to stay on top of this issue to give a little ease to their minds?
I guess that would depend on the kind of message that we're told, but certainly if it's something that we can share, then...
I don't quite understand what that means. If it's bad, you're not going to say anything. If it's good, you will.
Mr. Conard, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that there may be things that the state would rather announce rather than having the communities themselves announce those items.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conard. Are there any other residents which wish to speak tonight? Welcome back.
Hi. So I just want to know, what's like the next steps? Or you mentioned a meeting. I'm just trying to get clarification of how this kind of works.
So next Monday at 6 o'clock, we will schedule a meeting of the Parks and Recreations Committee to discuss the item again.
Okay.
The item will come back in 2 weeks to this group as City Council. They may make a final decision at that time. They're not obligated to, but that is the next step in the process.
And is anybody allowed to attend that meeting on
Oh,
Monday?
absolutely. Those
Okay.
meetings are open to the public.
Okay,
You're more than welcome to come.
okay,
They usually start at 6 PM, and they're held right here.
okay. Thank you very much.
If I might add, Ms. Schaefer.
Yes.
Any documentation or anything that you have to, in writing with your claim, with that permission aspect or anything
It was
else?
verbal. I can honestly just tell you it was a verbal permission. Like I said, I've lived there 15 years. The way my property line is set up, as nobody could get there to mow, take care of it, just based on the equipment that they do come in there with it, I've always kind of just done that. I did ask. They gave us permission. It's been like that for quite some time now. I did put this request in back in July to purchase the land once the park was doing a surplus with other people, so I figured it was the right time to go ahead and ask to pay for that piece of it, so. But, thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other residents wish to speak this evening?
Evening. My name is Greg Dixon. My address is 8545 Laurel Road, Pleasant Hill, Ohio, 45359. I used to work here, but it's been a while. I was here at the swearing-in ceremony, so I maybe said hello to almost everyone who was here, but I've been traveling around to villages and townships and cities because I am running for the open seat on the Miami County Commission, and I wanted to come in and reintroduce myself. For the last 10 years, I've been making hard decisions for the county. I've been committed to being fair and reasonable. I'm familiar with the budget system of the county, and I would hope that I could continue to serve the public service that has gone back from Troy and through the county. For the students here in the audience, I'll be giving my 30-minute stump speech at the end of the hallway, and if they want to join me for that after the meeting, I'll be happy to do that for them. I'll be here after the meeting if any of you have anything you would like to ask me. It's nice to be here again. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Honor. Best of luck to you in a couple weeks, and hopefully those students would get extra credit if they stick around for 30 minutes. Any other residents have anything that they'd like to say this evening? Seeing none, I do believe the students need something signed. I'll be happy to do that. Just come on up at the end of the meeting. I just want to remind folks, be respectful, be responsible, but more importantly, be a good citizen. We stand adjourned. Our next meeting will be March 16th, 2020, right here.